All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're diving into some pretty fundamental stuff. We're talking about the difference between those things that just have to exist, like they got to be there, no two ways about it. Those are what we call necessary beings.
Yeah, necessary beings.
Right, necessary beings. And then there's, everything else, like the stuff we see around us every day, the stuff that could just as easily not be here. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, those are the contingent beings. Like, you know, my coffee could have easily not existed.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So, we could talk forever about all sorts of fascinating necessary beings like, oh, I don't know, numbers or the laws of logic. But today we're zeroing in on one very specific question that you, our dear listener, brought up.
Ah, yes. And a fascinating question it is, too.
Oh, absolutely. So it's like this. Does God, the big G, actually provide the ultimate foundation, like the ultimate reason for why necessarily existing abstract objects actually exist?
Right. Because, see, this question, it's not just some theological debate. It really gets to the heart of metaphysics, which is, the study of what reality is actually made of, the fundamental building blocks. And when we talk about this grounding, it's super important that we don't get stuck thinking it's just one thing causing another, right?
Oh, yeah. It's way more than that, isn't it?
It is. It's even deeper than that whole idea of supervenience, where one thing can't change unless another thing changes. So, take Socrates, for example.
All right, Socrates, the philosopher.
Got it. Yeah, good old Socrates. And think about the set that contains only Socrates. So, logically, if one exists, the other has to exist too, right? But the existence of that set, it's grounded in Socrates. It doesn't go the other way around. You can't have the set without Socrates.
I see, I see. So even if we say, okay, God and abstract objects, they both have to exist. They're necessary. The question is God's existence the deeper, more fundamental thing that explains why those abstract things are there?
Exactly. Like, is God the bedrock? And, it's worth noting that in this whole discussion about God and these abstracta, a lot of times this whole grounding thing, it's talked about as like a creative power, right? Or even sometimes as an identity with God's own being. Like, they're not separate things.
Whoa, okay. That's pretty deep. So, for our listeners out there who are really into this whole king philosopher vibe, searching for that deep understanding, they might be wondering, why would anyone even think God is the reason, the ground for these eternal abstract things? Like, where's that coming from?
Right. Good question. Well, looking at what we've got here, it seems like there are two big lines of argument.
Two main camps.
Yeah, two camps. So the first one comes straight out of religious texts,
Yeah.
the foundational stuff from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all those creation stories.
So, like, God created everything, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And if God created everything, then, well, you got to figure that includes these abstract objects, these necessary beings.
Right. Seems logical. Like, where else would they come from?
Right. So just to give you a few examples, you got the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 89. It says, the heavens are yours, the earth also is yours, the world and all that is in it, you have founded them.
So God made it all, the whole shebang.
The whole shebang. And then there's Nehemiah 9, which says, God made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that are in them.
So again, everything, no exception.
Nope, no exceptions. Then you jump over to the New Testament, and in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, it says, all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. And they're talking about the Word, which is often understood as Christ.
Right.
And then there's Paul writing to the Colossians. He talks about all things, visible and invisible, being created through and for Christ. And even those early Christian creeds, like the Nicene Creed, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, they all say God is the creator of all things visible and invisible. So there's this really strong tradition in these texts emphasizing that God's creative power, it's universal, it covers everything.
Yeah, that's a pretty consistent message. And it's not just in those traditions either, right? Like the Quran also emphasizes God as the creator of all things.
You got it. In Surah 39, it says, God is the creator of all things, and he is the guardian over all things. And then in Surah 6, it reiterates, that is God, your Lord. There is no God, but he, the creator of all things, so worship him. So again, really strong emphasis on God creating everything, no exceptions.
So at first glance, it really does seem like an open and shut case. God made everything, therefore God made abstract objects too. But as we're all about here on the deep dive, it's never that simple, is it?
Never that simple. And this is where things get really interesting, especially, for that king philosopher listening in. Because, see, there's this philosopher, Peter van Inwagen, and he has a pretty compelling counterargument.
Oh, this should be good.
It is. So he suggests that when these texts say God created all things, what they really mean is all things that can be created.
Yeah, so there's a limit.
There's a limit. He's basically saying that all only refers to contingent beings, the things that can actually be involved in cause and effect relationship.
Cause and effect. Got it.
Right. And his point is that these necessarily existing abstract objects, things like the number 2 or the idea of triangularity, they can't cause anything. And they can't be caused by anything either.
Right. So they fall outside of that whole creation framework.
Exactly. It's not that God isn't powerful enough to create them. It's more like they're just not the kind of thing that can be created in the first place.
So it's a category mistake almost.
Yeah, kind of. He uses this analogy about quarks. Like, ancient people had no idea what a quark was, right?
Yeah.
But we still consider them to be created things because they're part of this web of cause and effect in the universe.
So it's not just about what specific things those writers had in mind. It's about what can logically be created at all.
Exactly. It's a much deeper point about the nature of existence itself, which is, what we're all about here.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this textual argument, which, Van Inwagen throws a bit of a wrench into. What's the other big reason folks think God grounds abstract objects?
All right, so the other big one comes from what's called perfect being theology.
Perfect being theology, all right. New term for the glossary.
Basically, this approach tries to understand God by thinking about what it means to be the greatest possible being.
So, God is perfect, and we're trying to figure out what that means.
Right. And one of the key things that comes with being the greatest possible being is this idea of aseity.
Aseity, all right. Another one for the glossary.
It basically means ultimate independence, like not needing anything else to exist. God just is.
God is self-sufficient.
Absolutely. So the argument here is that if you've got these necessarily existing abstract objects and they don't depend on God, then God isn't really totally independent, right?
Because there's something else out there that's just as fundamental as God is.
Right. And a being that's totally self-sufficient, with nothing else on that level, that seems like it would be greater than a being that exists alongside these independent abstracta.
Okay, so God, being the greatest, has to be the foundation for those abstract objects. He can't have any competition.
That's the idea. God is the ultimate bedrock of everything.
So for our king philosopher out there, striving to grasp the ultimate nature of reality, this line of reasoning has a certain appeal, right? Like, the ultimate source of everything should also be the source of these fundamental, unchanging truths.
You got it. But of course, there's a counter-argument here, too.
Of course there is. We're talking philosophy, after all.
Always a counter-argument. And this one basically asks, can God even control abstract objects? Like, can he really be their ground?
So we're back to that issue of whether God can create the uncreatable.
Exactly. Because if, like Van Inwagen said, these abstract objects are causally inert, they can't be affected by anything, then how can God have control over them or ground them?
Right, because grounding them would imply some kind of causal relationship.
And some philosophers even argue that the very idea of a necessary being depending on something else, even God, just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, something has to exist. How can it depend on something else to exist?
Exactly. It's like saying a square circle depends on someone deciding to draw it. The concepts just don't fit together.
So this argument from perfect being theology, it really hinges on what you think about the nature of abstract objects and whether they can even be dependent on anything.
Precisely. It could be incredibly persuasive, or it could totally miss the mark, depending on your philosophical starting point.
All right, so we've got these two main arguments for why God might ground abstract objects, but neither of them is a slam dunk. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. How have different philosophers tried to explain the how of this grounding? What are the mechanisms they've proposed?
Okay, good question. So one view that attempts to answer that how is called theistic voluntarism.
Theistic voluntarism, all right. Another one for the glossary.
And probably the most famous proponent of this view is René Descartes.
Ah, Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
That's the one. So theistic voluntarism, it essentially says that necessarily existing abstract objects, they exist because God wills them to exist.
God says, let there be the number 2, and boom, there it is.
Pretty much. It's like God uses the same power he used to create the universe to also create these abstract things like numbers and logical truths.
Okay, so God's will is the ultimate creative force.
That's the core idea. And Descartes himself actually said that God is the author of the essence of created things. And for him, that essence is basically the eternal truths.
So these truths, they don't just flow from God's mind naturally. It's a deliberate act of creation.
Exactly. God chooses what's true.
So for a king philosopher, obsessed with figuring out the ultimate reasons for things, this is a pretty powerful idea, right? God is totally sovereign, even over logic and math.
It is a bold claim, but it runs into a pretty big problem.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Yeah. The problem is, if God could have chosen not to will 2 + 2 = 4, or to will something else entirely, then how is 2 + 2 = 4 a necessary truth?
Right. If God could have made it something else, it doesn't seem necessary anymore.
Exactly. It kind of undermines the whole idea of necessity.
So how do theistic voluntarists deal with that?
Well, some of them try to get around it by talking about weak necessity.
Weakness, I'd say, okay.
So they might say that 2 + 2 = 4 in all the worlds that are accessible from our world, meaning all the worlds where God does will it to be true.
So it's necessary relative to our reality, but not in every possible reality.
Exactly. But this raises a bunch of other problems.
Let me guess, it's not that simple.
Never that simple. First of all, it kind of weakens the idea of God's sovereignty, right? Because if there's even one possible world where God doesn't prevent 2 + 2 from equaling 5, then there's a limit to his power in that world.
Even God has to play by the rules of logic somewhere.
That's what it seems like. And then there's this whole thing with modal logic, specifically the principle called S5.
Yes, 5, right.
S5 basically says that if something is necessary, then it's necessarily necessary. It couldn't have been any other way in any possible scenario.
So if 2 + 2 = 4 is only necessary because of God's choice, then it's not necessarily necessary.
Exactly. It becomes contingent on God's will, which might change in different possible worlds.
So theistic voluntarism, it really struggles to reconcile God's freedom with the absolute unchanging nature of those logical and mathematical truths.
It does, and that might be why it hasn't been a very popular view throughout history. It's a tough nut to crack.
Okay, so voluntarism is out. What's the next contender?
All right, so next up we have theistic emanationism.
Theistic emanationism. All right, added to the list.
This view tries to fix the problems with voluntarism by saying that necessarily existing abstract objects, they're caused by something that's not contingent, something about God's being that's unchanging.
So it's not about God's will anymore. It's about something deeper.
Right. Usually they say it's God's intellect or his cognitive activity. The idea is that 2 + 2 = 4, not because God decided it, but because it just flows naturally from his perfect understanding.
So it's like a necessary consequence of God being God.
Exactly. And this aspect of God's intellect, it's seen as fixed and unchanging in every possible world.
So it doesn't depend on God's choices. It's just part of his nature.
Right. The idea is that abstract necessity is rooted in the very nature of God's intelligence.
So who are some of the big names associated with theistic emanationism?
Oh, well, there's Leibniz, for one, the guy who co-invented calculus.
Leibniz.
Yeah, that's the one. So in his work Monadology, he talks about God's understanding being the region of eternal truths. Like, it's the ultimate source of reality in the realm of possibilities.
So everything that could be true is ultimately grounded in God's mind.
That's the gist of it. And then there are more contemporary thinkers like Thomas Morris and Christopher Menzel. They call their view theistic activism.
Theistic activism, got it.
And they explicitly say that God's intellective activity, it's what creates the whole modal economy, meaning everything that's possible and everything that's necessary.
So God's mind is the source of all possibility and all necessity.
Precisely.
Okay, so this view seems to address that problem of necessity that tripped up the voluntarists. If abstract objects flow from God's nature, and his nature is necessary, then their necessity makes a lot more sense. But I'm sure there are still objections, right? Nothing's ever that easy in philosophy.
You're catching on. And you're right, there are objections. One big one focuses on what are called God's critical properties.
Critical properties, like what?
Things like omniscience, omnipotence, and even the capacity for that kind of creative intellectual activity.
So basically all the things that make God, God.
Right. And the objection is that God has to already have these properties in order to cause abstract objects to exist. But theistic emanationism seems to say that that God's intellect brings about those properties in the first place.
So it's like God has to create his own ability to create.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
A philosophical chicken and egg situation.
Exactly. And critics say that's just not logically possible.
But I bet the emanationists have a response to that, right? They wouldn't just give up that easily.
They don't. They usually bring up the distinction between logical dependence and causal dependence.
Okay, so what's the difference?
They argue that God's ability to cause abstract objects, it might be logically dependent on him having certain properties, but it's not causally dependent in a problematic way.
So it's not like God has to cause himself to be omnipotent before he can cause anything else.
Right. It's more like there's a logical connection, but not a causal one. They say that logical circles can be okay for necessary truths, but causal circles are a no-go.
So it's a subtle distinction, but it's important. But even with that distinction, it still seems a little weird, right? Like, shouldn't God's essential properties come first in some way?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And that's where another objection comes in, which is even more tricky. It's called the bootstrapping objection.
Bootstrapping objection. Okay. That sounds complicated.
It is a bit tricky, but it's really interesting. So the bootstrapping objection looks at what it means to cause something to exist. And the idea is that to cause something to exist, you have to cause its essence, its inherent nature, to be exemplified or instantiated.
All right, let me try to wrap my head around that. So if God creates a red table, part of what it means for that table to exist is that it's red.
Exactly. So in creating the table, God causes the property of redness to be exemplified by the table.
Got it. So how does that apply to God?
Well, let's take the property of being omnipotent. Part of what it means to be omnipotent is to be exemplified by God.
Right, omnipotence is a property that God has.
So if God causes being omnipotent to exist, he's causing being exemplified by God to be exemplified by being omnipotent.
Whoa. Okay, my head is spinning a little.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but the point is that it seems like God is making himself omnipotent, which just doesn't make sense.
It's like saying you have to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. You can't do it.
Exactly. It's a logical impossibility. And this problem, it applies to other divine attributes too. Even God's very essence, the property of being God. If God causes being God to exist, he's causing himself to exist, which seems contradictory.
Because if he has to cause himself to exist, he didn't exist before, which means he can't be the one doing the causing.
You got it. So the emanationists, they have a real problem explaining how God can cause abstract objects to exist, especially those that are so closely tied to his own being without running into these paradoxes.
So both theistic voluntarism and theistic emanationism have some serious flaws. Are there any other approaches that try to explain how God might ground abstract objects?
Yeah, there are. And one of the most different approaches is called theistic mentalism.
Theistic mentalism. All right, let's hear it.
So theistic mentalism, it ditches the whole causal account altogether. It says that necessarily existing abstract objects aren't caused by God, they're actually identical to God's mental states.
So abstract objects are just God's thoughts.
That's the idea. Now, there are two versions of this. One says that God is distinct from his mental states, and the other says he's not.
So one's simpler than the other.
Exactly. We'll start with the one where God is distinct from his mental states. This view is often associated with philosophers like Greg Welty.
Okay, so what does Welty say?
He argues that abstract objects are basically divine ideas that exist only in God's mind. They don't exist anywhere else.
So there's no realm of abstract objects floating out there. It's all in God's head.
That's the idea. And one of the big appeals of this view is that it simplifies things, right? It reduces the number of fundamental things that exist.
So instead of having both God and abstract objects, you just have God.
Exactly. So for example, if propositions are just God's thoughts, we don't need a separate category of abstract propositions floating around.
So it's a very elegant solution in a way.
It is. But of course there are objections.
I should have known.
Always objections in philosophy. So one objection is that thoughts are usually seen as concrete events that happen in time, right? But propositions are abstract and timeless. They're either true or false, regardless of whether someone is thinking them.
Yeah, like the sky is blue. That's true whether I'm thinking about it or not.
Exactly. And propositions, they have all sorts of roles that thoughts don't necessarily have. Like, you can believe a proposition, doubt it, deny it, and they have truth values and modal properties, like necessity and possibility.
So it's not clear that thoughts can do all those things.
That's the issue. And then there's a question of what about other kinds of abstract objects, like numbers and properties? What kind of thoughts are those?
Yeah, it's easy enough to say that propositions are God's thoughts, but what about something like the number 3?
Right, what kind of thought is that? And how does this view account for the relationships between those abstract objects? Like how numbers relate to each other in mathematical systems or how properties are shared by different objects.
It seems like this view might just be replacing one set of abstract objects with a really complicated set of concrete thoughts that are supposed to act like abstract objects.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And then there's the whole issue of intentionality. Like, where does the meaning of a thought come from? Do God's thoughts get their meaning from propositions, or is it the other way around?
If it's the other way around, then propositions can't be just God's thought.
Exactly. It gets really messy really fast.
All right, so that's the first version of theistic mentalism. What about the second one, the one where God isn't distinct from his mental states?
Okay, so that one gets even more complicated. It's theistic mentalism with the doctrine of divine simplicity.
Divine simplicity, all right.
This one has a long history. It was championed by Augustine and Aquinas, some of the heavy hitters in philosophy and theology.
So what's divine simplicity all about?
It's the idea that God is absolutely simple. He doesn't have any parts, properties, or attributes that are really distinct from his essence.
So God is just one pure, simple being.
That's the idea. And if you combine that with theistic mentalism, then it means that all those abstract objects and even God's attributes are all just identical to God himself.
So the number 2, the property of redness, the proposition that the sky is blue, it's all just God.
In a way, yes. It's all one and the same.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. And it seems like it would raise all sorts of problems.
It does. It faces all the same objections as theistic mentalism without divine simplicity, plus a whole bunch more that come from divine simplicity itself.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Like one famous objection comes from Alvin Plantinga. He pointed out that divine simplicity seems to contradict the fact that God has all these different attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, and so on.
Right, if God is simple, how can he have all these different attributes?
Exactly. And Plantinga also argued that God himself isn't just an attribute. He's a being who has attributes.
So divine simplicity seems to clash with some pretty basic intuitions about God.
It does. And while there are ways to defend divine simplicity, it's definitely a controversial doctrine.
So it seems like none of these attempts to say that God grounds all abstract objects really works. Are there any views that say maybe he doesn't ground all of them?
Yeah, there are. One such view is called theistic Platonism. And one of the most prominent proponents of this view is Peter van Inwagen, who we talked about earlier.
Oh, right, the guy with the quark analogy.
That's the one. So theistic Platonism says that abstract objects exist, but they're not grounded in God.
So they just exist independently.
Right. Van Inwagen argues that because abstract objects are causally inert, they can't be created by God. They just exist as brute facts.
So God made the universe, but these abstract objects, they were just there alongside him.
Exactly. And this view has a certain appeal, right? It keeps God and the abstract realm separate.
But for someone who's looking for a unified explanation of everything, it seems a bit messy.
It does introduce a kind of dualism.
So how do theistic Platonists deal with those religious texts that say God created all things?
Well, Van Inwagen says that those texts should be interpreted in a limited way. He says they only refer to things that can be created, meaning contingent beings.
So the all things in those texts doesn't include abstract objects.
Right. It's only talking about the physical universe and everything in it.
And what about the perfect being theology argument? The one that says God would be greater if he grounded abstract objects.
Well, theistic Platonists say that it's just not possible for abstract objects to depend on anything, including God.
Because they're causally inert and necessarily existing.
Exactly. So they argue that God's aseity, his independence, doesn't require him to ground things that can't be grounded.
It's like saying God would be greater if he could create a square circle.
Right. It's a nonsensical idea.
So theistic Platonism, it's a way to have both God and abstract objects without having to say that one depends on the other.
Exactly. It's a way to preserve both divine aseity and the independence of the abstract realm.
Okay, so that's theistic Platonism. Is there a view that's even more radical?
Oh, there is, and it's called theistic nominalism.
Theistic nominalism. All right.
This view says that there just are no abstract objects.
None at all.
None at all. It's a pretty bold claim.
It is. So how do they explain all the things we usually attribute to abstract objects? Like, how do we do math without numbers?
That's the challenge for nominalists, that they have to find a way to account for all those things without actually positing abstract objects.
So it's like they're trying to rebuild the whole philosophical house without using any abstract bricks.
That's a great analogy, and it's a really tough task.
What's the upside of this view for a theist?
Well, the main advantage is that it completely avoids all those debates about how God interacts with abstract objects, and it also avoids those thorny issues of how to interpret religious texts in light of a Platonic realm.
So it's a simpler view in a way,
It is, but it comes with a huge burden of proof.
because they have to explain everything without abstract objects.
Exactly. They have to come up with completely new explanations for mathematics, logic, semantics, and metaphysics.
So it's a risky move, but potentially very rewarding.
It is. If they can pull it off, it would be a huge achievement.
All right, so we've got theistic Platonism and theistic nominalism. Are there any other views we need to cover?
Yeah, there are a couple more. They're kind of mixed views combining elements of the other positions.
So like philosophical hybrids.
Exactly. The first one is called mentalism Platonism.
Mentalism, Platonism,
So
okay.
this view tries to strike a balance. It says that propositions, those things that can be true or false, they're identical to God's mental states.
So that's the mentalism part.
Right. But then it says that other abstract objects, like properties and relations that aren't exemplified by God, they exist independently in a Platonic realm.
So that's the Platonism part.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a compromise.
It is. The main reason for this view is to avoid the bootstrapping problem we talked about with theistic emanationism.
Right, because if propositions are just God's thoughts, then he doesn't have to cause himself to have certain properties.
Precisely. But this view has its own problems.
Of course it does.
It seems kind of arbitrary, right? Why would propositions be mental but properties be Platonic?
And it still faces the same problems as theistic Platonism.
Exactly. Plus, it's not clear how it avoids the bootstrapping problem entirely. Like, what about propositions about God's properties? Are those just God's thoughts too?
If they are, then it seems like God is still causing himself to have those properties.
Right, so it's a clever attempt, but it doesn't quite work.
Okay, so that's mentalism, Platonism. What's the last hybrid view?
The last one is called anti-bootstrapping emanationism.
Anti-bootstrapping emanationism. That sounds very specific.
It is. This view is basically a direct response to the bootstrapping problem that plagues theistic emanationism.
So it's trying to plug a hole.
Exactly. It says that the abstract objects that cause the bootstrapping problem, things like the property of being God or being omnipotent, they exist independently of God.
So those are the exceptions.
Right. And all the other abstract objects, they're still grounded in God in the usual emanationist way.
So God emanates everything except the things that cause problems for emanationism.
Pretty much. But it seems a bit ad hoc, right?
Yeah, it's like they're just making up the rules as they go along.
It is a bit arbitrary. And it's not clear how you would even decide which abstract objects cause the bootstrapping problem and which ones don't.
So it's a solution that creates more problems than it solves.
That's one way to look at it.
So it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at arguments from religious texts, arguments from perfect being theology, and a whole bunch of different ways philosophers have tried to explain how God might ground abstract objects. And it doesn't seem like any of those explanations are completely satisfactory.
You got it. It's a really tough problem. And it shows just how complex these fundamental questions about reality can be.
And it's a testament to the power of philosophical inquiry, right? We're not just taking these ideas at face value. We're really digging deep and trying to understand them.
Absolutely. And that's what makes philosophy so exciting. It's a constant search for truth, and there's always more to discover.
So for our listeners out there, those king philosophers who are always striving for deeper understanding, this deep dive has hopefully given you some food for thought. We've seen that the question of whether and how God might ground abstract objects is deeply intertwined with all sort of other big questions about necessity, causation, the nature of,